Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to give our guests just about another minute here to log on, and we'll be right back. Thanks, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today titled Communicating Change, Lessons from Stories That Shaped History. We are happy to have you. We're happy to have our guest here from AMS as well. And I just want to start with a few pieces of housekeeping for us today. And the first thing is that we are indeed recording today's webinar. It's the number one thing that we'll get asked. Even though I'm saying this right now, I'm sure a bunch of you will still chat us, and that's okay. But we are recording the webinar today. Everyone will get an email that follows up the webinar that has this recording, as well as supplemental information as well. The second thing is that today's webinar is interactive. We're going to save time at the end of the webinar to answer your questions. But you can ask questions at any point in the webinar. Just go to that questions pane that you're seeing there on the left-hand side in the GoToWebinar interface, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end of today's webinar. So with that, I want to introduce myself as well as our guest today. So our guest is Jason Tomassini, and he's coming today from Atlantic Media Strategies. Jason leads their editorial initiatives, helping organizations tell their story and engage with audiences online. Prior to joining Atlantic Media Strategies, Jason led digital strategy, audience engagement, and media relations for Digital Promise, an education technology nonprofit. He's also worked in newsrooms as a staff writer for Education Week and as a contributor to the New York Times, Washington Post, and Reuters. He's a graduate of the University of Delaware and earned a master's in digital media from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Jason, welcome. I am Gabe Cohen, Senior Director of Marketing and Communication here at GuideStar. I am just going to be moderating today, so you're not going to hear too much from me other than questions. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it right over to Jason. So Jason, oh, actually, I forgot. I'm doing an intro, so I'm going to start a little bit. Sorry about that, everybody. I will
getting out of that, Gabe.
Yeah, I will also note that both Jason and I are fighting colds right now, so if we sound a little bit froggy, apologies in advance. So the stories that Jason's going to tell you today are from 1859, 1897, and 1963. And when we were leading up to this webinar, one of the things that I kept thinking about was how can you contextualize stories going back to the 1850s in today's media landscape? And so I wanted to think a little bit about what the types of communication mechanisms were and how people were getting these news in 1859, 1897, and 1963. So I went on Wikipedia and looked into this a little bit. And in 1859, two of the major means of communications were the Pony Express and then newspapers. Newspapers were booming in the 1850s. In about 1840, there was only about 1,000 of them in the United States, and by mid-1850s, there was about 2,500. So a pretty big means of communications then. By 1897, the telegraph was relatively popular, and telephones were starting to increase in popularity as well. About 0.4 out of every 100 people in the United States had a telephone come 1897. But still pretty difficult to get access to these things. They're not ubiquitous all over the culture at this point. By 1963, many people had radios and many people had televisions as well. But if you wanted to be a content producer during any of these times and any of these mechanisms, you really had to be someone that either had resources or connections to some really high-level means of communication at those times. And when you think about today, that's just not the case, right? Almost all of us have computers, and I would say almost all of us also have cell phones as well. And just with those two devices, through blog posts, through Twitter, through Facebook, through Instagram, we can tell those stories. We have control, so much more than the last 200 years when you think about it. So it's really a benefit from that perspective that we can take advantage of it. We can own our own story arcs when we go through things. So I just want to keep that in mind, whether you're a small little mom and pop nonprofit or whether you're a larger organization, we all have the means to control our own narrative. So with that, now I will actually hand it over to Jason. Jason, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Gabe. I'm glad we did that intro because I think it was a really interesting, quick run through communications over time. And thanks, everybody. Excited to be joining you all today. So as Gabe mentioned, this is called Communicating for Change, Lessons from Stories That Shaped History. I'm with Atlantic Media Strategies. For those of you that don't know, we are the creative and consulting division of the Atlantic magazine, which means we were created to bring insights and best practices from a media company like the Atlantic and its sister properties and bring those to life for organizations including nonprofits, foundations, Fortune 500 companies, universities, etc. A lot of my work, because my background in journalism and nonprofit communication is now with mission-driven organizations, and so I'm excited to be chatting with you all today. And what we're going to do today is take a look at 3 stories from the Atlantic's history and what we can learn from how those stories were able to achieve societal impact and how you might apply some of those lessons to your work. I think Gabe's intro was helpful because our goal today is to take even some of the most prominent pieces from the Atlantic's history and make it applicable to any organization regardless of their size and focus. And so why do we think that this is an important topic to focus on? Why do we think it's important to go back into the history to learn lessons? I mean, this has been, I think, as an understatement, a really chaotic and unprecedented time for both the political landscape and also the media landscape, the latest chapter of which played out in Alabama last night. And one of the things we've really heard from our nonprofit client organizations this year is, we're really not satisfied with just gaining people's attention. We're really interested in how can our communications actually achieve impact. And it's obviously an important goal and focus area, and hopefully some of the stories that we talk about today will help you all think through that. And the reason that that's been so important is because of what we've called a double hurdle problem. Because of the complete unprecedented avalanche of content that everyone is experiencing nowadays, there's 2 hurdles that nonprofit organizations and many organizations have to jump over. The first is just getting people's attention to begin with, and then all the effort, all the resources, all the content that goes into doing that. What does that leave you with in terms of actually connecting your communications and your message to actual outcomes and impact? And that's the second, much higher hurdle that we're finding is much more difficult to leap over. Great, so why don't we get into the program today? We wanted to start with a little bit of history from the Atlantic. And so, again, you might say, well, what do we have to learn from the Atlantic? We're not a magazine. We're not a large media company. But I think what we found is there's a lot of lessons from the Atlantic, especially because of its history, that nonprofits and mission-driven organizations can learn from. And I think it's important that while the Atlantic magazine does not have an agenda, as you see here in its Declaration of Purpose from 1857, it is very explicit that it is of no party or clique. But it has proven that telling compelling stories and elevating intelligent and provocative perspectives can lead to the kind of impact that a mission-driven organization might strive for. And it's what the Atlantic, since its founding, has focused on and sort of described as being the exponent of what it is to what its conductors believe to be the American idea. So how can you be that exponent? And that's what we're going to focus on today, with 3 stories that have changed history and what they tell us about how anyone can be the exponent of their own idea today. Great. So the first story that we're going to focus on is from 1897. It's The American Forest, which was written by John Muir. At the time, Muir was a fierce advocate for the environment, and this article was a key part of a relentless campaign that spanned several years to save the American wilderness from the human forces that at the time were threatening to ruin it. And at that particular time, just to give them the pulse of the country at the moment, economic growth was really paramount. And a lot of that was being driven by the logging industry. You can see this chart of the lumber cut in the United States from 1820 to 1920. At the time of John's article, it was just explosive growth. And that was not something that at the time people were concerned about. They saw that as a part of the country's economic growth and development, and folks felt, positive about that. And so when people looked at the forests of the United States, they saw something like this. They saw something that was unsophisticated, untamed, a symbol of anti-progress. They saw it as something that was desolate and really just getting in the way of the economic growth that was so important to people at the time. And so John Muir realized it was going to be very challenging to convince people that they were wrong about that particular fact. He needed a different way to frame the issue in people's minds. And so what did he do? What he did was he thought carefully about what people really cared about at the time, and figured that if he could connect the issue of America's forests to those other cultural narratives, he could change the way people thought of them and inspire them to potentially want to save them. And so what he focused on were two cultural threads that were prominent at the time. One was Romanticism, which was a movement in literature and the arts that had originated out of Europe and migrated over to the U.S. at around this time. And really, Romanticism emphasized imagination, beauty, emotion, and also nationalism, the sense of national pride that pervaded the country at that time, in large part because of the aforementioned economic growth. And so in his piece, there are really specific ways that he played into these two issues that people really cared about at the time. You see this quote, which I'll read: "The forests of America, however slighted by man, must have been a great delight to God. They seem to be favored above all gardens of the globe." So amid that very flowery language, you can see that he's playing with people's nationalism here. He's framing the forests of our country as the most beautiful in the world, uniquely blessed by God. And he stirred up this sense that the forests belonged to all of us, and it was our civic responsibility to save them. He also put forward an argument that other countries had put forward laws that had been successful in guarding their forests, and he intimated that while America was uniquely blessed by God in natural beauty, it was actually lagging behind other countries in its efforts to preserve that beauty. So you can see he's playing into nationalism in a couple different ways at the time. And in this quote, wide branching oak and elm spread a leafy canopy along the coast of the Atlantic, a green bill we see in summer, golden and purple in autumn. Here he's really playing to the Romanticism. This vivid imagery is taking people, is immersing them in the natural world. It's positioning the American wilderness as a romanticized escape. And as you can see, he's starting to change the narrative around forests from what people might have seen at the time. And actually, instead of the dark, desolate forest that people might have, pictured previously, now they're looking at it as something like this, which is something that we today might more associate with our national forests. So he changed the way that people felt. That was important, but he also didn't stop there. He wanted to deliver a clear call to action. Once he got people to care, once he got people to think differently, he wanted to make sure that he left them with something to do about it. And so he put forward a strong directive, which you'll see on the next slide. God has cared for these trees, saved them from drought, disease, avalanches, but he cannot save them from fools. Only Uncle Sam can do that. This is a really specific call to action to a specific audience, the federal government. And you can start to see his goal here. He's building support among the general reader for forests, but he's putting the onus on a specific entity, in this case the federal government. And this piece, coupled with all of the work that John Muir was doing at the time and the environmental movement at the time, really helped inspire some powerful results. And so he had worked a lot with President Roosevelt at the time, He had taken him on some hikes in some of America's national forests, and it really put a lot of pressure on the federal government at that time to do something about this. And what it did was it led to the creation of the U.S. Forest Service, the expansion of Yosemite National Park to the 1,100 plus square miles that it is today. And also it led to later legislation that declared national monuments throughout the West during Roosevelt's time in office. And this really laid the groundwork for the national park system that we all know, experience, and love today. So it wasn't that this individual article led to all of those outcomes, but it was a key part of an overall campaign and effort that was led by John Muir and his colleagues at the time. And so what does this piece teach us about the stories that we tell today? I think the lesson here is that it's important to understand the mental map of your audiences. It's important to understand the perspectives that they have on your issue, and rather than try to forcefully persuade them otherwise, think about the things they care about and use that to have a conversation with them about your issue. I think it's important, the progression of the piece that John Muir wrote. A lot of organizations try to jump straight to the actions that they want their audiences to take instead of considering this mental map. And so really you have to think about it in a few different ways. One is figure out the action that you want people to take. Understand the perceptions that surround your issue. What are the barriers or potential accelerators to those actions? And then, like Muir did, find the right cultural threads or narratives to reshape those perceptions. So we're going to show an example from our work where we feel like we're able to apply some of these lessons to a modern organization. So World Food Program, specifically World Food Program USA, is obviously a well-known organization that wants to encourage people to take action on world hunger. However, working with them, we know that it's not as simple as just giving people a means to donate, a button on their website, a fundraising drive. They need to really understand people's mental maps about world hunger and what are the perceptions and emotions that people have about it. And so some of our work with them, we tried to understand this mental map. And one of the perceptions around hunger is that it's perpetual. Throughout history, obviously, there's been hunger, and when people perceive it this way, they don't necessarily see themselves as part of the solution, and they also don't see themselves as part of the problem. They think it's always going to be there, and there's nothing that I can do about it. And that is a huge barrier to getting people to take action. The other thing is that people think hunger is insurmountable. They see it as a problem that stands alone. They don't understand why people are hungry and the different issues that actually lead to hunger around the world. And this means they might oversimplify the solution. Oh, well, those people need food. So where are the organizations that are providing food? They don't necessarily see the true issue of hunger and its complexities, and may be less motivated to take action. So we actually worked with WFP USA on their website to try and position hunger as an issue as something that people could engage with. And we wanted to show them that it was urgent. It's not an inevitable condition or a constant condition. It requires immediate help. So you can see some of the urgency in the language on the site here. Also that it's multifaceted. The site shed light on the many issues surrounding world hunger. It is related to climate change, accessibility to education, natural disasters. And actually they've taken in their storytelling a little bit of a journalistic approach to their own issue and really thinking about the systemic connections between hunger and many other parts of society. And the idea here is that you can take action, you can influence some of these systems and ultimately have an impact on world hunger. And then finally, that it's solvable. It's not an inevitable condition. We can get there together. What they did in this particular case on their website is use really strong language and storytelling, using case studies to show that a solution is possible, and making it also really easy to donate. So there are actually stories on their website about the solvability, so to speak, of hunger, and there are donate buttons within those stories. And so integrating the donate button into maybe a more broader exploration of hunger helped drive people to feel like they could be part of the solution, and then gave them real ways to be part of that solution through fundraising. And so ultimately it put the user first, and we did this through a lot of stakeholder interviews, also analyzing different pieces of content that were currently on the website for their ability to kind of play into some of these different parts of hunger that we wanted to communicate. And really what it comes down to is diving into what audiences care about and the stories that are going to ultimately move them. And so that type of research and understanding the audience's mental maps enabled us to not only create a website that would enable any organization to tell stories that really help change perceptions on their particular issues. And the website being approached this way, I think, we're happy to say had some real tangible results. One is that it increased website sessions by 124% since its launch last year, and it's also increased revenue from website donations by 344% since last year. And that's not to say that the mental map lesson here is what led to all of that. Obviously, there's been a lot of political and cause-oriented momentum that might have led to this. But you can see how you can potentially create more real connections between people's perceptions of your issues and the actions that you want them to take. So again, the lesson here, understand the mental map, and I know Gabe had a couple of questions about this particular lesson before we move on to the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to pause for a second here, a couple of quick housekeeping things, and then I do have some questions for you. The first is that if any of you guys are seeing an alert pop up that says that the recording is going to be saved on your hard drive, that's not the case. These webinar programs are pretty fun to deal with, and they always throw us curveballs. But no, we are not storing this recording on your hard drive. It will be emailed to you, though. So. The second thing is just make sure you're asking questions. As Jason goes through these slides and shares these stories with us, make sure you're asking questions in that questions pane as to anything that's applicable to you and your audiences as well. So with that, I want to hammer in a little bit on one of the themes that you were talking about through that first chapter, if you will, about kind of turning impact into stories and vice versa a little bit, that it goes both ways. Love the concept of integrating donate buttons right in with the narrative so people can feel their impact more. I think that's a really valuable piece of advice that a lot of nonprofits out there could take to heart. How do you think organizations can better understand their audience perceptions of their own organizations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it really runs the gamut. There's really formal ways that you can do that for some of the work that we did with WFP, for instance, user testing, audience research, that kind of thing. And obviously that, yields a lot of really useful information, but that also might not be within the resources of every organization either. But I think as you went through the history of communications over the last 200 years, one of the real benefits that we have now is the ability to get immediate audience feedback through any number of low-cost digital channels. And so the Atlantic, even at its massive scale, is still running a lot of really small tests to determine how its audiences are interacting with different issues. They may run 30 to 40 A/B tests a week on their Facebook page or their social channels just to test different messages and different reactions to different types of pieces. If you can't do 30 to 40 a week, maybe you could do one a week. And sometimes those tests using Facebook's tools, for instance, can be $50, something like that. And what you can do is start to really set up a targeted understanding of how people are perceiving a particular issue, whether it's how they're engaging with different messages, whether one topic or potential angle on a single topic is more resonant than another. And then the other thing is you can just go out and talk to people.
Yeah.
And I think, whether that's the old-fashioned way of going out into the field and meeting with your constituents, or setting up formal ways to use your networks to get some of this type of feedback and understand their mental maps. And again, not necessarily just put your outcomes first, but think of your audiences first. Before you ask them to do something, think about how can we make sure we actually are getting them to care about something first. So I think it can be informal and formal, but the key is to really put your audience at the center of what you do.
Yeah, when I was listening to you, I was reminded of a webinar that we did earlier this year with Facebook and Best Friends Animal Society. and the creative director for Best Friends Animal Society, joined us and was talking about one of the things that they learned through testing was that when they show animals up for adoption on their site, that they should always be happy pictures of the animals, and that works so much. The dividends that they see in the adoptions increase, website traffic that leading to adoption, increased adoptions, is just through the roof when it's happy pictures as opposed to sad pictures of the animals. And I don't know if that is something that you would intuitively think. You might think that kind of the emotional response you would get from a sad picture of an animal would lead to more adoptions, but that's not what people want. They don't want the sad animal in their home. They want a happy animal in their home. So that story was really resonating. A couple of tools that come to mind in the marketing world with GuideStar. Twitter polls, super easy, free. You can do that. You've already got kind of a chunk of your audience that's paying attention to you. And then Qualaroo, too, I think is a pretty low cost. They may even have a free resource as well that people come to your website. You can just ask them what you think about whatever the topic is that's front of mind. So.
And it's important to know running one test is not going to tell you something that should upend or change your entire strategy. It has to be something that you actually build into your ongoing work. And we found that, again, it might seem daunting at first, but if you can build in some of these kind of iterative tests and workflows into your process, it can really build your understanding of your audiences over time without being an enormous undertaking.
Yeah, absolutely. Great.
Awesome. Thanks, Gabe. So we're going to go to the next story, which is Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, which was published in The Atlantic in August of 1963. And some of you may know that it was eventually published in Letters from Birmingham Jail was eventually published in The Atlantic, but you might not know that it wasn't originally published there. And that's why the story behind the story, I think, is really important here, and it actually begins a few months earlier in April when MLK was arrested in Birmingham for demonstrating against segregation without a permit. And so when he was in jail, he wrote this article on scraps of paper and in columns of newspapers that were smuggled to him. And he specifically wrote it in response to a statement in an April 12 newsletter called A Call for Unity, which was made by 8 white Alabama clergymen against King and his methods, essentially denouncing King and his team. And so throughout the piece, MLK's response was focused on religious, legal, political, and historical grounds. And he actually sent this sort of scrap paper jigsaw puzzle back to the headquarters of his movement. And then they sent it off to media outlets, and they first sent it to the New York Times. And while we're not sure exactly why, the New York Times decided not to publish it. So their loss. And then his team looked to other outlets that might be willing to publish it because they wanted to get it out to the public. And so it was published in 3 places in June of that year. It was published in small publications. One was called Liberation, the other was the Christian Century, and the other one was the New Leader. And these were all mostly local, relatively small outlets. And over the course of the summer, as the civil rights movement was growing, MLK and the people behind his movement realized that this letter and the underlying issues behind it and the underlying points behind it needed a wider audience. And so they did send it to The Atlantic, who published it in their August issue, in the weeks right before the March on Washington. And so we like to call this the original smart resurfacing, pre-internet. So a concept that we really use at The Atlantic and at Atlantic Media Strategies with our clients is this idea of resurfacing. That things from your archive, your most important pieces, should not only be published, the focus around them should not be on their initial publishing, but actually the life cycle of that piece over time and the potential life cycle of that piece. We've had cover stories in The Atlantic that 6-9 months after they were originally published ended up receiving wider reach than they were the first time around. And actually, in fact, close to 60% of The Atlantic's traffic on its website comes from pieces that were not published that particular month. And so actually MLK is using this concept even pre-internet. And so you see here the circulation of those original pieces where the letter was published, and then the circulation of The Atlantic. And so what was potentially had the chance to be overlooked and forgotten in June of that year suddenly had this large moment in August of that year as the March on Washington approached. So what they were really doing was they were matching their distribution of their content to what was happening around their issue. And that was ultimately what led them to look to the Atlantic to publish this piece right at the moment when the entire nation was about to take note. So as everybody knows, 250,000 people marched on Washington on August 28th, coming together from all over the nation. And that was just weeks after that issue of the Atlantic hit the newsstands. So you can't directly attribute these scores of people and the success of the march to this one Atlantic piece. But you can see that this piece is part of a bigger whole, a relentless effort to repackage, resurface, and react to different events that were happening around their movement. And ultimately, it led to this powerful crescendo. And then it also led eventually to change the next year when President Johnson signed the landmark Civil Rights Act. So in actuality, we focused on just the moment around the publishing of the letter, but this was a campaign that played out over close to 2 years. And there's, different moments along the way where MLK and his movement are trying to use the conversations and moments that are happening nationally as jumping off points for their particular message. And so the lesson here, there's the timeline. So the lesson here is to adapt with the conversation arc. Many organizations make the mistake of building your campaign that is really stiff and internally focused, and it's really focused on a release moment or a launch moment. And actually, the release moment or launch moment is only one part, and potentially even a very early part of a much longer potential conversation arc that you can service. And so you really have to consider the whole of the discussion surrounding your issue and create campaigns and messages that are flexible and externally motivated, not internally motivated. And that requires really understanding the landscape surrounding your issue, the momentum that's unfolding, and look for different moments to place yourself at the center of that landscape. And so we're going to look at a kind of maybe unlikely example where they were able to take this lesson and really put it to use, and that's WAMU, the local public NPR affiliate here in Washington, D.C., who we worked with. And when we started working with WAMU, they were in a position that a lot of media brands, particularly in radio, find themselves in. They were struggling to adapt to changing realities and audience habits. They also had this added challenge. It was sort of an asset, but also a challenge, of the fact that NPR, the parent brand, was in its backyard. And it really had a hard time establishing its own identity in the face of NPR, and really at that point had fallen out of touch with Washington and the community that they served. They realized they weren't really adapting to community needs, and they wanted to think about, what does it mean to be the local station for a national city? What does it mean to be both in Washington but also of Washington? And how can we actually explain Washington to itself but also to the world? So what it needed to do was really understand the differences between people's perceptions of Washington and what they knew to be true because they were part of this community. So a lot of people think Washington is one-dimensional, the center of political power, uneducated and unequal, stodgy and stale, inept and bureaucratic, cynical and corrupt. I mean, yes, some of those things might be true, but we're all here sitting in Washington, D.C., and we actually probably want to focus on the attributes on the right side, which is that it's multifaceted and culturally diverse. It's a forum for authentic discussion and debate. It's intellectual, it's young, it's fast-paced, and it's home to really some of the most passionate people on the earth. And so WAMU wanted to think about how can we tell that story of Washington, both to the people that live here, but also to people outside of the area. And so what they did is try to work some of their, work local elements into some of their programming. They wanted to feel more place-based. And so they were really responding to the Washington community's needs of wanting something for themselves and not just feeling like an affiliate of NPR. And so what we've helped work with WAMU on is positioning themselves not as an institution, but as a brand that's in continual conversation with their community. So some examples. One is live events all around Washington, D.C. They're broadcasting from musical breaks that are now featuring new artists that are local to Washington. New local podcasts like Anacostia Unmapped, which turns the mic over to residents of D.C. Residents of the neighborhood Anacostia to interview people in their own community. And then finally 1A, and I think this is where the conversation arc example really starts to take shape. 1A is a podcast which explores the First Amendment during the Trump administration. And so as all of this work that WAMU is doing to really establish its own local identity, one that it can really carve out within the community, they're also looking at the conversation arc about Washington as a city. And as this is happening, especially over 2016, they're realizing that a lot of people are turning to Washington to try and make sense of all of the political unrest and all of the political events that are happening. And so 1A is uniquely positioning WAMU to look at an issue that is really of Washington, First Amendment during the Trump administration. But you can see how by capitalizing on the national conversations, they can start to build a national audience. And so this podcast actually was so timely and rode that conversation arc so well that it's now been picked up by many other local NPR stations as a way to have programming that really focuses in on what's happening in Washington and bring that to stations across the country. It's now actually syndicated through 215 NPR stations around the country. And they've also, in early 2017, launched the Trump Effect, which is an interactive reporting initiative to explore the impact of the new administration on the region's populations of federal workers, diplomats, politicians, and power brokers. So again, a story that has to be told from within Washington, but has much broader resonance outside of Washington because of what's happening in the political and media landscape. And so some results from WAMU. One is they've really increased the diversity of their listeners. They're now ranked the #1 local station, NPR station in the country, and they've actually increased their donations also from a broader cross-section of individual donors. And so, that goes to show that they are resonating more within the community, but also attracting supporters from outside of it. Great. So again, the lesson here is adapt to the conversation arc. And I don't know, Gabe, if you had any questions about this one in particular.
Yeah, first an anecdote that gets to the WAMU story that you were talking about. At least for me, it worked. I'm a longtime WAMU listener, and I actually started donating and became a recurring member as of last year.
I did not know that information.
Yeah, no, we did not talk about this. This is not planted. But yeah, so kudos on getting me to open up my wallet from that perspective. We got a couple of comments a little bit about the double-edged sword of today's media landscape and questions as well. Tamara made a comment just about the proliferation of media outlets and social media and how can stories remain relevant long enough. And I think that it really is a double-edged sword as to a moment in time and catching that wave of whatever the topic of the day is. So how can organizations monitor these larger conversations that, if you're creating a plan today, tomorrow, it may not be relevant anymore. So how can they really pay attention to that?
So one of the mantras that we have at The Atlantic and at AMS is that timeliness matters, timestamp doesn't. And so if you think about a lot of organizations, they want to react really quickly to something that happens that's relevant to their issue. And that requires a lot of effort, requires a lot of internal review. It requires people to kind of upend their daily work to get out and respond to something because they're focused on the speed of that response. And what we found is that organizations are more successful if they think about, well, what can we actually do to add value to this conversation in a way that shows we are thinking about it in a relevant way, but are not so focused on speed and reaction that we put a lot of stuff out there that ultimately nobody sees. And so, a few things that we've seen different organizations do. One is a simple thing. Many of you may already do it, but having an editorial calendar is really important to be able to actually map some of your content efforts to what's happening externally. And we found that actually you can add a layer to those editorial calendars that's really helpful, which is actually the moments and milestones that you know are coming that are going to have important impact on your issue. Layer that on top of your calendar and think about how we create things for those moments that have a chance to, resonate and lift up. I'm sure the MLK and his team did not have an editorial calendar, but they were clearly anticipating a moment and planning around that. And the other thing is you can use a lot of different tools to really stay plugged into your audiences and understand what's going on. You can use obviously the basic stuff like trending topics. You can use newsletters, Google News alerts. But you can also, from the previous lesson, do a lot of testing on things of which type of messages have a chance to rise above the sort of daily news cycle and have some kind of lasting impact.
Yeah, I like that. It makes me think about how can your organization provide a unique point of view to the conversation, and I think that's what's important as these conversations kind of come and go is how is your organization positioned to comment on it from a unique perspective. Let's keep going to our last topic today, and then again we'll come back to questions at the end.
Awesome. So our last story today is from 1859, and it's called Ought Women to Learn the Alphabet? And it was published anonymously, and it was later credited to Thomas Wentworth Higginson when he later published a book that included this essay. And Higginson at the time was a steadfast proponent of women's rights, and is probably best known for compiling and publishing the Women's Rights Almanac for 1858 with Lucy Stone. And so he was really a prominent activist at that particular time, but in this case was publishing this piece anonymously. And so at that time in 1859, women's rights was a huge topic, as it is today, and it had been advancing slowly and steadily over time. Women were still 60 years away from being able to vote, but they were legal citizens. They could buy property in every state except for Illinois and New Jersey. Don't know what was going on there. And Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania had even given women control over their own earnings. And believe it or not, people were giving themselves big pats on the back for these developments at the time. And so the issue had kind of been forgotten. People had sort of taken for granted the fact that, there was equality for women. And so Higginson needed to find a fresh way into this entrenched and well-established issue. And he did that through this piece, Ought Women to Learn the Alphabet. And his fresh angle in was education, which at the time was another hot topic, was not one that had sort of faded to the background, but was really at the forefront of people's consciousness. And this was on the heels of the encouraging area of education in the U.S., when the government encouraged the establishment of school districts, raised taxes to pay for them, and also this was a real-time, really at the outset, a real time of renaissance for higher education, when they sort of took on the cultural prominence that we associate with them today. And so instead of thinking about education as this big macro topic, he actually drilled down on the notion of the alphabet to prove his point. And so by beginning with something so elemental, he made his premise impossible to argue against. Few people would argue that women should not know the alphabet, and from there it's an easy path to making the case that they deserve a lifelong education and higher learning. So let's look at some of the things that he did in this piece to make that point. He really marshaled history. This is a list of all the different historical figures that he referenced throughout this piece. It's worth noting this was kind of a tongue-in-cheek satirical piece. I recommend everyone give it a read when this webinar is over. But by doing this, he really was able to provide a sweeping take of how women's intellect had been perceived or framed throughout time. He referenced Voltaire's quote of, "Ideas are like beards, women and young men have none." So again, he's being satirical here. But also he's referencing Catherine the Great, who received the same education as her brother and was known to have learned much faster and had a greater sense of intellect. And this was all in service of an argument that was extremely forward-thinking for the time, that women have been limited not because of an inferiority to men, but because of the circumstances they have been given. And So he makes this case a couple different ways. The career of eminent men ordinarily begins with colleges and ends with fortune and fame. Woman begins under discouragement and ends beneath the same. Again, you're rhyming here, so there's a kind of tongue-in-cheek conversational element to this. Give an equal chance and let genius and industry do the rest. Every man for himself, every woman for herself, and the alphabet for us all. So again, he's ending with a call to action for everyone. Give an equal chance and let genius and industry and do the rest. And actually, again, this article was part of a broader movement that did have some really specific outcomes. One of which is that Sophia Smith, a woman from a wealthy American family, was inspired by this piece and the efforts of Higginson to found Smith College in 1871, the vision of offering women an equal education to men. And obviously people know Smith College very well today. And so what made this story so powerful? It's the idea that you can evolve your issue through new intersections with other issues. And you can keep your long-standing issue that people might associate with you fresh by attaching it to different issues of the day. And what you're doing is two things. One, you're maintaining relevance while ensuring your conversation endures over time. But you're also giving people more specific inroads to the actions that they should take. For instance, starting a women's college. That might not have come out of the more broad and generic women's movement at the time. And so what we call this is the power of the ampersand. And so this has been an issue for the Atlantic that we've seen them focus on throughout time. Higginson found power by marrying two big, broad ideas together, women's issues and education. And this is something the Atlantic's done time and time again, especially around this issue. So they've focused on women in college, which is something they've explored over time, most notably in 1957 with the hallmark piece, Sex and the College Girl by Nora Johnson, which the main point of that was that contemporary college girls were getting trapped in unsatisfactory long-term relationships instead of exploring their freedoms, which was a really influential piece at the time. Women in technology. So earlier this year, Why is Silicon Valley So Awful to Women, a piece that really uncovered a lot of unfair practices in that industry and really contextualized a lot of smaller events and movements that were happening over time. Women in Emotion, you might know, check out Megan Garber's piece, All the Angry Ladies, which was examining the post-Weinstein, Harvey Weinstein moment and discussing some of the cultural stigmas around how women express their anger in public throughout history. And so we've also seen this in different types of organizations that may be associated with specific issues. So we also work with the Truth Initiative, which everybody knows has done incredible work reducing smoking rates, especially among youth. And they wanted to keep that conversation fresh and alive because the smoking rates nationally among teenagers are so considerably down. People might have assumed that it wasn't a problem anymore, but in reality it really is a problem, especially among specific underserved populations. So they thought about tobacco and what? Tobacco and the military. That is actually an area where tobacco companies are still targeting a lot of their advertising and marketing, and smoking rates are especially high. The same is true of tobacco victims of mental illness. And Truth Initiative has done a lot of work to uncover the practices of the tobacco industry targeting people with mental illnesses. Tobacco and employers, so putting the onus on employers through different programs to help reduce smoking among their employees and their staff. And then tobacco and race. And so if you look a lot at the Truth Initiative's current messaging, it's really positioning tobacco use as a social justice issue, where in fact minorities, low-income communities, rural communities, the smoking rates are not only much higher than they are nationally, but they're as high as they are as almost any country in the world. And so you might have seen a recent report they put out called Tobacco Nation, which essentially says that a certain sliver of the United States, if you were to take that part of the United States itself, would have one of the highest smoking rates in the world. And so they've really figured out new ways to position an issue that the casual reader or audience member might think is something that has been overcome and maybe is not worth their attention. I know you have about 10 minutes left, so I think we can probably just go straight to the audience questions. Does that sound good, Gabe?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're getting a fair amount of questions that are coming in, but if you have anything else to ask Jason or myself, feel free to just enter that through the questions pane.
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll just, so again, lesson involved new intersections, and just as a sum up, I will leave you on this slide the 3 lessons that we shared with you today. So understand the mental map, adapt with the conversation arc, and evolve through new intersections. And yeah, happy to take questions.
Great. Well, I want to start. We got a couple of questions that came in during the second part of the conversation of adapting with the conversation arc and repurposing pieces. And the first question we got from Colby was just talking a little bit about the timeline of that. When is the right time to resurface something, and what are some kind of easy ways that organizations can start to do that and start to figure out what that cadence is for their own organization?
Sure. So I'll talk in the sort of day-to-day terms, but also longer term. So day-to-day, the Atlantic will if they have a big story that they really want to get out there, they will republish it every 48 hours. And that's to their organic social channels.
Yeah.
But within those 48 hours, they actually might be running tests among certain target audiences to figure out what is the best treatment for this piece, so that as we continue to publish it, we know the messaging that's going to be most resonant with the audiences. And so they might publish something every 48 hours for an individual piece. Longer term, you have to really think about what are the moments where this piece that you have might be able to resonate with people in a new context. So I think the best example of this was from 2015 with the cover story, What ISIS Really Wants, which was published in the Atlantic in April of that year. It originally had about 4.5 million unique visitors to the piece. Unfortunately, in I think October, November of that year, there were the terrorist attacks in Paris. And so obviously a story contextualizing ISIS and really exploring its motivations is going to be relevant again at that time. And so they republished it. They didn't apologize. They didn't, show that it was published 6 months before. They just published it within a new context and a new story. And that second time around, it received 6.5 million unique visitors. So the idea is that even if the same 4 million from the first time around read it the second time, you still have 2 million people who've seen it for the first time. You have to think about that with your organization. You might think, oh, well, people have seen that already. In reality, most people haven't seen anything. And so I think that's an important kind of mindset over time to just think about as you try and put content into new context.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that we started doing at GuideStar a little bit that we found success with is just in case you missed it, the ICYMI of something that we think is interesting and that people might still find interesting if they did miss it. So often we think that everyone is looking at their Twitter feeds all of the time, constantly, and you forget that that's just not the case, that people have lives.
Most people miss it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way to look at it. A kind of specific question that we actually got from a couple of different people. Rita asked, many newspapers don't want content that's already been published online or in another outlet. How can organizations resurface when outlets want fresh content?
Oh, you mean in terms of getting things placed in different...
Yeah, this would be when you're kind of taking it outside of your own media atmosphere and then trying to bring it to a different audience in a media outlet.
Got it. Well, I mean, I think, what we've found is that, and you mentioned it, the power of having your own publishing platforms should not necessarily be dismissed. I mean, yes, it's always amazing if you can get a piece placed in a much larger outlet with a much larger audience, but that shouldn't be the only goal that you have. You can publish pieces through your own channels and through different types of distribution methods, potentially get the same type of reach for those pieces as you would those published elsewhere. I think the other piece is to figure out not necessarily just media placements, but content partners.
Yeah.
So who are folks that have, some overlap in mission and goals, but maybe have audiences that you're not typically used to reaching, and how can you create partnerships with them where you may be able to share content back and forth and ensure that you're at least getting broader reach than just your own channels. The Atlantic has a partnership like that with PBS NewsHour, where similar ideas, similar approach to journalism, similar sort of credibility among audiences, but broadcast audience versus magazine audience. And so they have a content sharing partnership where they're able to kind of share stuff back and forth and get new eyeballs on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I like thinking about kind of the Venn diagrams of how you can find a partner where they've got something that they care about, you've got something that you care about, but kind of that combined middle space where you both may be able to gain from engaging with each other's audiences. I like that a lot. We have a question here. How can we reframe stories that people think they already know? I see some guidance in the examples, but also wonder where the line is between tapping into hot topics and avoided subjects that are too topical or may be seen as political. Any thoughts on that?
So on the political thing, I mean, I think that's where it requires some good strategic conversations internally about what are our guidelines for the types of things that we want to talk about and how political do we want. One of the things that we do with a lot of our clients is setting editorial guidelines, and they're grounded in a few different things. One is what are their audience's needs? So developing editorial guidelines around that. Two is what is your unique value proposition? So going back to an earlier point of you really should be focusing on how do we add value and do something that people can't get anywhere else, especially if you're not a breaking news organization. And then the third thing is what is our goals and our mission? And that's a little bit squishier in terms of how it actually relates back to your content. But I think if you're able to have a good definition of your editorial guidelines around those things, audience needs, value prop, and mission, that'll help you sort of narrow what it is that you actually about and talk about, and also set clear expectations for your audiences about what you're going to cover and what you're not. That's a really good question, though. I think it's something that we've seen organizations really struggle with this year because there's so many things that you could respond to. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And it's knowing kind of when is it right for your organization, when does it align with your mission to go ahead and dip your toes into those sorts of conversations.
Absolutely.
We have another story here about kind of the length of stories that's optimal, and that's a little bit of a specific question, but I'm curious if you can give some guidance as to what you have seen both on the AMS side of things and then also on the Atlantic side of things. Is there generally both a length that seems to work, and then is there also outlets that you've found that have been really good at communicating these pieces in today's pretty small attention span that we've all got these days?
It's a really good question. I wish I had the data in front of me, but I'll give you the general trends that we've seen. So the Atlantic has a lot of big cover stories, and what we've found is that the length for those cover stories is not any deterrent for readership. And so most of our most engaged stories are also our longest. But there's a middle ground where you see drop off. And so after around 800 to 1,000 words, you're going to get potentially stagnant or diminishing returns for your piece. But then when it gets up to the 8,000, 9,000 word range, then you start to see things really lift up. Now, of course, an 8,000, 9,000 word PDF report is probably not going to get the same results as The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so I think the lesson there is, like, if you're going to go deep, and really put your resources around it and really put yourself in the best position to get the return on investment on that. But if you're padding things for the sake of padding them, you're not going to get better results. And then the other piece in terms of short form content is I think it's important to really just tailor it to the actual channels and platforms that you're using. And so if you have something that only requires a short, small space to tell a story, you don't have to tell it on your website. You can tell it on Instagram, you can tell it on Facebook, you can tell it in a newsletter. And so you have to think about, for short form content, it's not just the article page that needs to be the vessel for that. You can think about the channels that people are most likely to use and use those as storytelling platforms as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was something I just wanted to bring up, was the power of imagery and pictures is something that we see over and over at GuideStar, how important that is. So thank you. We are pretty much out of time today, so I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us. Jason, thank you for coming on. Thank you to everyone out there that took some time from this busy giving season. We not only wish everybody a happy holidays, but also good luck with your end-of-year donation campaigns. I'm sure that's something that everybody is focused on right now. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the year, and we look forward to connecting with everybody again in 2018.